And now, the third topic I would like to propose has to do with the recent mass shootings again, this time in Texas. It does look very unlikely that anything substantial will be done to stop the sale of assault weapons in the United States. Yet more than half the population, I don't know the exact numbers, but a substantial part of the population want an end to it. Millions of Americans refuse to have arms in their house. Here in Europe, media focus on the so-called strength of the lobby of the National Rifle Association. There is, of course, in the United States, the history of a colonial settler society, slavery, but also decades of violence, of US foreign policy, police violence, and an electoral system that blocks any political alternative like a social democratic party of some sort. At the same time, while I'm saying that, I do really abhor the many times smug comments here in Europe, as if we do not have our own problems to settle. Yet, it remains a fact that the US is remains exceptional on this issue. What can this really change, and what should be done to change it?
Well, let's start from the current situation and look at how it developed. You can look at this morning's newspaper, New York Times, Washington Post. One of the most prominent Republican senators, John Thune, one of the more reasonable Republicans, I should say, not an avid Trump worshiper, said Americans have to have semi-automatic military rifles in order to shoot prairie dogs. A prairie dog is about this big. It's a little rodent that runs around in the West, practically extinct. But Americans have to have semi-automatic military rifles, repeating, because they have so much fun hunting prairie dogs. That's this morning's newspaper, supported by the Republican Party, all the Republican Party. They're not going to let anything pass because Americans, there was a poll taken about 3 or 4 days ago after the Uvalde massacre, 19 kids and teachers killed. 44% of Republicans, 44% say the United States must tolerate repeated mass murders in order to protect our freedom. Freedom means freedom to run around with a semi-automatic rifle in a marketplace, okay? That's almost half the Republican Party. Incidentally, after the Uvalde massacre, there have been dozens of others after, okay? The Supreme Court is now, in a couple of weeks, will make a decision, probably suspend a law that goes back to 1913, over a century. In 1913, New York State passed some regulations on concealed carry, meaning carry a weapon concealed. It passed some regulations saying you have to have some authorization for that. Very likely the Supreme Court will overthrow that, meaning that people can run around the United States everywhere, church, school, anywhere, carrying concealed weapons, and they don't need any training, any prior registration, anything. Well, that's the country now. Why is it happening? Well, to see why it's happening, we have to go back to the 19th century. The 19th century, it was a very violent century. The United States was destroying, genocidal destruction of the native population. Well, back when the Constitution was framed, you needed guns for that. In fact, let's go back to the framing of the Constitution. Why was there a Second Amendment in the first place? There were 3 major reasons. One was there was almost no standing army, and the British were a major threat. That was the threat at the time. So you needed a militia to, or in fact, you read the Second Amendment, it starts by saying, in order to preserve a well-organized militia, the right of guns should not be infringed. Reason, the British are coming. Second reason, you had to murder Indians. You had to invade the Indian territories, destroy them, exterminate them, and that required guns for a while. By the mid-century, a more efficient killing machine had replaced the militias, the US cavalry. Now that carried out the job. You didn't need militias anymore. Third reason was slavery. You had to ensure control of the slave population. States like South Carolina, slaves outnumbered whites. There were slave rebellions going on all over the Caribbean. So you needed a well-ordered militia to control the slaves. Well, by the end of the century, none of those things applied. It's important to recognize. And the gun manufacturers were in trouble. The Civil War was over. They lost the market. Europe was in relative peace. They had lost the European market. What are they going to do? They launched the first huge propaganda campaign in history, advertising campaign. It concocted a totally mythical story of a Wild West, the kind we see in movies. Sheriffs fast on the draw, brave cowboys going off to save people, and totally invented. There was nothing remotely like that in history. Cowboys were guys who couldn't get a job, so they pushed cows around. There were no sheriffs. I mean, all the stuff. I believed it when I was a kid, Lone Ranger, Wyatt Earp, really exciting. All totally invented, but it sold. Of course, the punchline at the bottom was your 12-year-old son has to have a modern Winchester rifle, otherwise he won't be a man. So they were able to sell guns. Well, the culture took. As I say, I believed it. I suppose you believed it when we were kids. To this day, people in Europe watch cowboy movies and don't know it's total fantasy, but it sold. Well, then let's go to the next step. Richard Nixon. Nixon understood something very important. The two parties in the United States are both business-run parties, but the Republicans are more extreme. They're the more extreme faction of the one-party state, the business party. And Nixon realized they can't get votes by running on their actual program of support for the very rich and the corporate sector. People don't vote for you on that. So they have to turn to what are now called cultural issues, divert people's attention away from the policies and get them to focus on something else. Well, for Nixon, it was racism. The worst racist laws had been overthrown. The Democrats had been supporting them. So we can win the Southern Democrats over to the Republican Party by portraying ourselves as the racist party. Well, that was pretty successful. By mid-70s, it extended. One of the chief Republican strategists, Paul Weiser, realized that if the Republicans pretended, I stress, pretended to be opposed to abortion, they could win the huge evangelical vote and the Northern Catholic vote. So they all turned on a dime. They had all been what's now called pro-choice, but they suddenly became passionately anti-abortion. Reagan, George H.W. Bush, a whole bunch of them. So now that's a Republican position. You have to be anti, but none of them care at all, but that's the way you get votes. Then came guns. They said another way to get a lot of people is to be in favor of guns. Poor, hardworking Americans, law-abiding Americans have to have their guns. Then the Supreme Court came along, the ultra-reactionary Supreme Court. In 2008, Scalia, writing for the majority, published an opinion which is worth reading. He reversed a century of precedent and said, forget about the business of a well-ordered militia, just drop that. Just keep to everyone has a right to a gun. So he reversed a century of precedent and said, Second Amendment gives everyone a right to have a gun. It's a very interesting decision. He does not mention in it any single one of the reasons why the framers imposed the Second Amendment, none of which had any meaning by the 20th century. Just ignores them, nothing. It's a very learned opinion, all sorts of quotes from the 16th century and so on, but it totally ignores every reason why the Second Amendment was enacted and said, now everybody can have a gun. Well, that turned the Second Amendment into holy writ. You do a poll among Americans today and ask what's in the Constitution. First thing they'll say is the Second Amendment. When Trump tries to mobilize the crowd, first thing he says, you have to defend your Second Amendment rights. It's become a religion. That's why you can get a Republican senator today, this morning, say, we have to have semi-automatic military rifles to shoot prairie dogs. And people don't laugh. It's become a crazed religion. And that's the history, basically.